I hope you don't mind that. And Oleg, now I think the floor is yours, please. Well, you're welcome to start.
Yes.
And yeah, you are, I guess, welcome. Everybody's welcome to write their questions in chat. I think, Oleg, is it fine for you?
Absolutely, yes.
And then we will look at them after the talk, and you will be able to answer them. So the talk is roughly an hour, and then there will be about half an hour for questions, discussion, and whatever. Please.
Yeah. Does everyone see my slides?
Oh, no, так.
Yeah, okay.
I
Good.
think so.
Yeah, very good. So, Danya, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to to speak about my interests, and also thank you for inviting me as an inaugural speaker instead of someone else. I mean, I'm kidding, but I do appreciate the invitation very much. Okay, so I will begin with from kind of afar, from what constitutes humanities and what constitutes the sciences. There is this quite famous distinction between two cultures, which is many decades old, which distinguishes between the main idea is that there are some differences between the way research is done in the sciences and in the humanities, and we can describe it with this simple table where there's one row for the methods, and so humanities typically use qualitative methods, while sciences typically use quantitative methods. And the second row has to do with the type of questions which are being asked or the theories that are being proposed. And humanities usually, like traditionally, have been asking like ideographic questions. So questions about some unique events and very specific phenomena, like a particular book, a particular historical event, and so on. While sciences typically, not always, but typically ask nomothetic questions, questions about some general principles, what is the second law of thermodynamics or something like that. Actually, that's not the best example, but recently, 10, 20 years ago, the divide between the methodological divide have been bridged, because 10 years ago it was still quite controversial that humanities could use quantification, and today it's already quite accepted, that DH has managed to convince everyone that it's here to stay, and quantitative methods became quite widespread. But the second row, it remains very controversial, I think. The idea that we can do quantitative analysis to study some regularities, some basic principles of culture, of arts, of literature, usually are met with a mixture of irony, disbelief, and irritation, I should say. And I'm saying from personal experience because I have met all of them. Fortunately, this is rare, but this happens. But I think that it's very important frontier and research territory where almost nothing has been done, but the number of hidden discoveries is still big. And the main message of my talk will be that we can and should use the quantitative methods for studying the general principles of culture and cultural change, including change in literature. Okay. And in fact, as you know, so digital humanities sometimes uses the term distant reading to describe the methodology which is being used, or the general approach. The very name distant reading was introduced by Franco Moretti in a paper where he was interested in testing a particular nomothetic hypothesis. I will read a quote from his paper. So, and then without really knowing what I was doing, I began to treat Jameson's insight as if it were, one should always be cautious with these claims, but there's really no other way to say it. as if it were a law of literary evolution. In cultures that belong to the periphery of the literary system, the modern novel first arises not as an autonomous development, but as a compromise between a Western formal influence and local materials. And this conjecture of Moretti, it's interesting, and it is convincing to me, but clearly it did not convince many other literary scholars, because while the study of world literature became a small field of its own, and so became distant reading, even a bigger field, virtually nobody speaks of the laws of literary evolution these days. Why not? I think that a shift from ideographic questions, where we focus on a particular trend or particular book and so on, to nomothetic questions is a fundamental tectonic shift in our approaches. And to convince an academic community to cross this tectonic bridge, you need much more evidence. And this evidence did not exist back in the year 2000 when Moretti was publishing his paper. But this evidence is much more abundant today. Over the last 10, 20 years, 30, maybe depending on how you count, there emerged a whole new research field called cultural evolution, that aims to study those general principles of cultural change. And the figure on this slide is from a recent paper that was like reviewing the publications in cultural evolution. And on the one hand, it shows that there is an exponential growth in the number of papers published on this topic, but also it shows that, while there are different disciplinary clusters in this network of scholars who study cultural evolution, because some of the people here, study linguistics or come from linguistics, some come from anthropology, from cognitive science, even from like animal behavior. There are still very strong links between those different clusters, and in effect, we see kind of like the emergence of the new field. That's what that's at least how I interpret this chart. So the sheer amount of effort today, to study the nomothetic questions is much larger than it was, say, 20 years ago. And that's why I'm hoping that cultural evolution is also here to stay this time, and maybe it will be possible to convince more people to pursue similar research. And another reason why I think that the pursuit of general questions will be more productive this time is that the cultural evolution approach is taking quite a like a fundamental attitude towards scholarship, so that it builds its theory from the ground up. So it begins from some very basic principles of cultural change, like what are the nuts and bolts or the cogs of the cultural transmission. And you can distinguish between different types, some of which I just plotted for an illustration here as some toy examples. And then you can assemble much more complicated processes and build the like mathematical and agent-based models of these processes, and then compare them to real data, and so on. All right. So this is just like a very general intro, like my preaching to you that cultural evolution, or the kind of stuff that I'm doing is hopefully interesting. And if you want to learn more, you can check my paper on this about the evolution of modern literature and film. And also I'm writing a book about this, which is hopefully soon will be done, but not yet. Okay. So I think that this general nomothetic approach to culture, you might say like, okay, some people are doing something like asking some general questions. Why do we need this? Why is this relevant for our research? And I think it is relevant because it allows to look from a very different angle at several very important concepts that lie at the core of humanistic research. And these concepts are, or this buckets of problems, so to say, are related to artistic success. Why do some authors or books become best-selling or canonicals, and why others do not? The question of creativity, like, what is creativity? How exactly it emerges? Why some centers are more creative than others? Why we have those explosions of creativity in some places and times, and in other cases we do not have this. And finally, it allows us to rethink the very nature of historical thinking. And I will give you several examples of this. And in general, so my talk will look like following. So I will first briefly describe each of these kind of concepts and how cultural evolution allows us to rethink it with the example from my own research. And then later I will focus on one particular case study to show kind of in more detail this kind of research. And hopefully you'll find it interesting. Okay, so why does a book or a movie become popular? So, or successful? One common answer is quality. So for example, Harold Bloom, often called the most famous American literature critic of the last several decades, has said that the most prominent authors in the canon have, and here I'm quoting him, the primal aesthetic value, free of history and ideology, and available to whoever can be educated to read and view it, which I find it a little funny, like the particular phrase, whoever can be educated to read and view it. This is a very meritocratic view of success, according to which good things become successful things, and success is always deserved. When you have a great writer or a very famous writer, canonical writer, it's because this person deserves their place in the canon. And his book, The Western Canon, which was like a huge bestseller, it has 26 authors, and all of which are claimed to be in the canon deservedly. But besides this aesthetic value, there are many other nomothetic principles that actually can be studied. And I'm not really questioning that aesthetic value plays a big role. It does, most likely. But also there's a lot of other things that should be taken into account when we study cultural success, and aesthetic value, or like the goodness of something. It is a useful simplification, but probably no more than this. So, for example, recently my colleagues Mason Youngblood, Olivier Moran, and myself, we did a paper where we used API of Spotify to collect almost 1 million of songs belonging to 10 genres, both recent genres and not 10, but 110, sorry. Both recent genres and old genres of music. And our question was, songs become successful because they're good, but also maybe some songs and artists become successful because they happen to be early members of their genres. We borrow this prediction from economics that about the first mover advantage, that whoever moves early on into an empty niche has larger chances to become successful for a bunch of different reasons that I will not dive into right now. And we collected this data, and if you look at the plot plot A, so it shows the temporal distribution of songs in the genre of chillwave. So at first there were a few songs, and then there became many songs, and then on the panel C, on y-axis you see the normalized number of times each song was played, or like its play count, so to say. And what we were expected, so our prediction was that there should be a negative relationship between normalized play count and the year of release of that song. And we do see a slight negative relationship between these two things, so that earlier songs are, according to the model, are expected to be more successful than the later songs. And to check for this hypothesis, we also collected an additional data set of songs belonging to random genres, and then we kind of sampled these songs so that they have the exact same distribution as our target genre. But because songs in that random sample do not belong to any single genre, we do not expect them to exhibit this first mover advantage. And so we do not expect to see the negative relationship between success and the year of release. And the effect here is small, as you can see, but it's very consistent. And we found the exact same thing in I think 95 out of 110 genres that we were looking for, which is a very robust effect. Now the question is, we can come back to Harold Bloom's interpretation of artistic success, and we can ask, could it be that some of the canonical books were also first movers in some areas or some genres? Is it possible? Maybe yes, maybe no, and this is something to be tested empirically. Another way another concept that we can rethink would be the concept of what is creativity and how exactly it works. A common view is that artists are some sort of creative geniuses, the exceptional individuals who move the arts forward. And this view, I don't think it's really present in the academia. It's more of a popular thing. So I used as an image like a gigantic head of Franz Kafka, which you can see in Prague. By the way, the funny thing that the head is kind of rotating all the time in a funny way. But I think this view is present in academia implicitly, in the sense that we tend to focus on individual figures very often, instead of looking at the broader picture, and thus implying that those individuals really deserve all the attention. And I don't know, maybe they do, but there is a different view of creativity that is suggested by the research in cultural evolution, where creativity is a collective process in which many individuals contribute with their small innovations, which eventually accumulate to something large, to big trends. And as an example of this, here is a paper that I did with my colleague Petar Tinic, where we wanted to look at the innovation process in films, in the film industry. We collected a large data set from Internet Movie Database, IMDb, and specifically the data on film crews, who was doing what in the movie process. Our theory or expectations was that instead of seeing something like the fashions, that, or some cycles of fashion, or that some jobs would become popular and then would disappear, and then other jobs would become popular. So instead of this, we would see something like an accumulation of innovations, which in cultural evolution is called cumulative cultural evolution. The process of movie production would be becoming more and more complex because new type of jobs will be invented to deal with new challenges, or to contribute some new interesting parts to the end product, which is a movie. And on the panel A, you see, so each colored line is shows the innovations that were made in a particular decade. So the first pink line are like the innovations that were made in the 1910s. And on y-axis, you see the proportion of movies in which the jobs that were introduced in that period were present. And as you can see, for example, the job producer was present in many movies in 1910s, and then now it's present in 100% of movies. But then you have other jobs like Steadicam operator, which was not present before 1970s, but then it got very popular afterwards when this technology was invented. And we can track this accumulation of innovations in film. And what we do find is, first of all, the tremendous increase in the complexity of film production, but also we find that the innovations that are being made, which are here shown with blue dots, usually do not disappear and are transmitted to the subsequent decades of film production, showing some kind of accumulation of innovation similar to the one we see in the technological process. Finally, the third part of or the third big concept that we can look at anew using cultural evolution theory is the very nature of kind of historical change, or the way we look at history. Because how do we think about historical change in the humanities? That this question was studied by Ted Underwood in his book Why Literary Periods Mattered, who described this predominant view of change as period thinking. And according to this view, history is sliced into periods, profoundly different, perhaps mutually incomprehensible modes of life and thought, as Underwood wrote. And also he said that there is this habit of narrating history as a sequence of contrasted cultural movements, which caused literary studies to develop in a one-sided way, and produce blind spots that limit the development of the discipline. And so what are those contrasting movements? Well, things like you see actually on the cover of his book, like romanticism, realism, modernism, and so on. So these periods we have in literature, but also it's very typical to think in periods, when you think also about art history, about music history, and so on. And again, I want to say that this is a useful simplification, which was understandable before we had a large cultural data set, but which probably is no longer so useful, because we can obtain a much more complex picture of how exactly historical change was happening. And as an example, so this is a work we are doing now in progress. It's not something that was finished yet, but this is something that we're now actively researching with a bunch of colleagues that you can see listed here on the plot on the left. So we are trying to build those networks of like dynamic or historical networks of literary evolution, where each color on this figure represents like a community of authors who were most likely influenced by each other, and each color represents a genre of literature. And as you can see, sometimes, well, these genres never really, so you don't have like a clear cuts between them. What you see that usually they coexist at the same time, and there is a much more complex interplay. Like some genres borrow from each other, others are not really related. And I think this is something that so much more work I hope will be done in a direction like this, where we could see this bigger map of the historical development of literature, and get a more complex understanding of the historical process. Okay, so this was my general overview, and now I would like to dive kind of deeper into my current work that I'm doing, that is related to the third problem, the problem of how exactly historical change in literature is happening. And this part is actually tries to combine or to connect large-scale studies of literature with demography. I'm doing this work with Brett Beheim, who works here in our institute. And by demography, I mean the following. So what are the relationships between artistic innovations and more broadly change and birth, death, and age of the creative individuals or authors? Although in principle it doesn't necessarily relate to literature. It could also be about music, about painting, about literature, literally anything else. Because the transmission of artistic forms and topics is not happening in the vacuum. It's happening in the real human beings that have certain age, that are born at a certain time, and like how does that influence the large-scale patterns we tend to find with our methods. We're not the first to ask this question. So there are several precursors that I know of, and maybe more that I don't know of. One is Franco Moretti. So probably some of you know this figure from his one of the chapters in Graphs, Maps, Trees, which shows the lifespans of genres in British literature, where each line shows basically like a lifespan from more or less the time when the genre was born to the time when the genre sort of stopped being very popular, or when experts typically agree that this genre lost its relevance. And what Franco Moretti noticed is that if you look at the beginnings of the genres, you see something resembling steps, so the line is not really straight, but it's kind of moves in a zigzag. And his explanation was that we have those zigzags because of generations. He said that once biological age pushes a generation to the periphery of the cultural system, there is suddenly room for a new generation, which comes into being simply because it can. And so, because like a new generation of artists, of writers come, like most of them kind of, start writing on a very different topics simultaneously and kind of abandon the stuff that their precursors were working on. Franco Moretti used very limited data for this study, and recently there was a more detailed work done by Ted Underwood, Stephen Vasey, and their colleagues who wrote this very nice paper, Cohort Succession Explains Most Change in Literary Culture, where they decided to test this idea using a large data set called HathiTrust Corpus of Books. And they made a model, a structural equations model that was predicting. So the goal was, so first they did topic modeling, and then they on this corpus, and then they built this model, the goal of which was to predict a topic of a book. And it could have two variables to be used. So one variable is the birth year of the author, and the second variable is the publication date of a book. And the question was, what is a better predictor of a topic? Is it the birth year, which would mean cohorts or generations, or is it the year of publication, which would mean something else, something like individual change, social learning, and so on. And to give you an example, so here we have like different authors and their careers. For example, Agatha Christie, and you see that she was writing on a bunch of different topics, which are shown here in different colors. So each dot here is a book, and the color indicates the dominant topic of that book. And as you can see, she mostly was writing on the same stuff. Like she was mostly writing on a very small number of topics. But also we have writers who were more frequently changing their topics, like this Chester B. Himes. I don't know who that is. Another interesting thing that we can see that that this small plot shows is that here we have two authors that started their careers more or less at the same time, and both of them are writing on the similar topics. And then 10 years later, we have also authors who started their careers later, and they write on already on some other topics. So this is what they were trying to find, whether the comparative role of birth year versus the publication date. And what they found was that the birth year is more important as a predictor than publication date, meaning that cohort effect is quite strong in literature, and maybe more strong than something like individual learning. They found that if you look at the kind of distribution of only between these two effects, if you imagine that only these two things matter, then around 55–60% would be attributed to cohort effects or generational effects, and only 40 or 45% will be attributed to, well, something else, like say the impact of the overall context that these authors were dealing with. Couldn't topics just be infected by the current stage of the world, technology, language change, etc.? This is a good question, because language change is definitely something to be concerned with, because the current state of the world, something like technology, it's definitely related more to this. I don't think that it is a confound of the study, because you can easily imagine that because I will talk actually about this later, but because something is changing in the world and writers start writing about this stuff, this is definitely can be explained through this process of individual learning. But language change is more problematic. You're right. Okay, so they found this, and then it also is related, this kind of research is related to a famous quote of Max Planck, who said that a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die, which is also known as, science advances one funeral at a time, so to say. And also there was a recent paper that showed that indeed when you have the sudden or unexpected death of a prominent scientist, interestingly, their whole subfield loses in popularity and in importance. And usually people from the outside replace, the collaborators of this famous scientist, which sort of seems to prove the hunch of Max Planck. And so the question would be, does literature also advance one funeral at a time? That's another way of looking at the same problem. To deal with this question, we basically tried to do sort of the same stuff that Underwood, Vasey, and their colleagues were doing, but from a very different angle. So we took inspiration from biology and ecology, because there are some very good techniques of kind of like addressing the same question. And also our hope is that it gives us some new it gives like higher resolution of our findings than was available with the method used by Underwood and Vasey. So I'll begin with talking about trend lines, because this is usually how we depict, some historical change that, for example, we have some particular trait, say some topic in a book, and then, it either increases or decreases. And trend lines like this are often used, but they are not very often explained. And when they are explained, this typically happens in the following fashion: that usually we would say that there is a cause X that is driving this trend line upwards, for example. But in reality, most likely the situation is much more complicated, and you'd have something rather like this, that you have different causes which are pushing from different directions, and sometimes you would even have, even though the trend line is keeps moving upwards in these two cases, the causes that are driving it upwards can be quite different at different parts of the curve. And it would be quite useful to have a method which allows to parse out those different factors that may influence the trend line. And some of these factors can be generational. And today I will focus on those generational factors. So the method that really allows to tackle this problem was introduced a while ago, almost 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, by the mathematician George Price. In his seminal paper Selection and Covariance, where he introduced this equation, which is commonly known as the Price equation. So he wrote many equations, but this is the one, the most important, the one he's remembered for. And it consists of two I will not really explain it in detail now. I'll explain our version of this equation. But what must be noticed that he tries to explain a historical change, a change of a particular trait through two different processes. So he's decomposing the change of a trait into the factors of selection and the transmission bias. And what we'll be doing further, we will be also decomposing change into a lot of different things using a method like this equation or inspired by this equation. And this approach is quite common in ecology and in demography. And there's a bunch of great work on using it for explaining, I don't know, variation in usually in phenotypes of animals, but also in a lot of other things. So decomposition equation. In our case, it looks as follows. So basically, we want to explain a growth of a particular topic or a mean value of a particular topic through three components, three terms. First of all, we are interested in the influx of authors or the arrival of new authors or entrance of new authors. Second, we're interested in the exit of authors, like, I don't know, symbolic death, so to say, of people, funerals. And then finally, we have a term that is tracking the individual change of authors, basically when an author switches from one topic to another topic. And how exactly we do this? So basically, this term, it tracks the covariance between the frequency of a topic and the birth of authors. So that, when a topic happens to grow or appear at the same time when, in a book, in the first book of an author, this term will be growing. Also, this term will be growing, or this effect will be growing if an author is changing their topics a lot during their lifetime, and this effect will be growing if the topic is suddenly changing during on the last book of an author, on their sort of the exit book or their funeral. We came up with some creative visualizations for this process, which hopefully allows to capture kind of intuitively what we are doing. So imagine that we have some topic, which is, having this curve, it was growing and then it is declining. And each change between periods is represented. So each black dot would be the mean value of this topic, right? Then each colored bar is kind of the height of this color bar is proportional to the amount of change. If we have like a large change, we have a large color bar. If we have small change, we have a small colored bar. And the three colors on this bar correspond to the proportions of the entrances, exits, and individual change of the authors. So, for example, this would be the size of the positive entrance effect on that particular stage. This would be the size of a negative entrance effect, and this would be the size of a negative exit effect, for example. And this also can be shown in a more traditional way using this line plot, where you simply have plotted against time the sizes of different effects. And as you can see, during the first half of this period under observation, we have a very strong entrance effect, meaning that this topic was in a lot of books written by young authors, the authors for whom this was like the first book, right? And also a strong effect of individual change, meaning that also a lot of people for whom this was not their first book were switching to this book, right? But then later, what we see is the negative, very strong negative entrance effect, meaning then a lot of authors who are writing their first book are not including this topic in their work. So stuff like this. That's how you interpret these figures. The approach we took next was, because, we did this, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work on our data, maybe we did some mistake. So first, we wanted to test whether it works on simulated data. The data which we simulate according to certain mechanisms that we have very good control of, that we really know how they work. So for example, imagine that we have some topic T, which has this particular increase and then decrease curve. And this topic can be generated by two very different processes, namely the processes that Underwood and Vasey were talking about. One process would be the turnover of cohorts, right? So each gray line here is a career of an author. He or she were publishing different books, which are indicated by these dots. But then some of these books marked in red were on this particular topic. And many authors who were born around the same time are writing on this, on this topic. So this would be an example of a cohort turnover or generational effect. In the second case, we have more of a situation of a zeitgeist or some historical event, for example, influencing many authors at the same time. Imagine that, the First World War is happening, and then many authors for whom, this book is not their first book are switching to this topic, right? But what is kind of interesting is that even though these two processes are very different, they generate the same curve. How do we distinguish between these two? So first, we simulated a lot of cohorts. So we built a stochastic simulation that generates this careers or trajectories of the authors, and then they write it on different topics, and then we use our decomposition analysis based on the price equation to figure out whether it allows us to actually catch this turnover of cohorts. And our expectations would be that we would see on this type of figure, we would see a lot of this blue color, a lot of effects of entrances, and a lot of effect of exits, but not so much individual change, because, right, the authors keep writing more or less on the same topics when they were born more or less at the same time. And this is exactly what we are finding with our analysis. And then as the next thing, we decided to simulate a lot of situations of, when a historical event or supposedly historical event is making a lot of authors change their topics. So, there was this person was writing on a lot of stuff and then suddenly changes and starts writing about the First World War, for example. Does our method allow to also capture this change? Yes, it does. And because in this case, we see a lot of the term or the effect of individual change is really strong, swinging in both directions, while the other two effects are relatively small. So our method seems to work. A good way of visualizing also the relevant importance of this effects is by using the ternary plot, where each vertex or each vertex of the triangle is a particular effect. So quite conveniently, we have three different forces, and so we can use this type of plot for visualizing our results. And the closer the dots are to a particular vertex, the stronger is the pull of that effect. So that this type of process would generate. So here I plotted the 10 simulations of the cohort effect, and here I plotted 10 simulations of the individual change, and you see they end up in different corners because for this type of process, it's mostly driven by the entrance effect and to some extent by the exit effect. But this one is mostly driven by the individual change and to a smaller extent by the entrance effect and almost none by the exit effect, and so on. So we can use these triangles to look where each particular topic ends up, on this kind of like a triangular diagram. Finally, it's time to move to the real data. So what we did, basically, we did kind of the same as our precursors. We took the same corpus, HathiTrust corpus of books, which is a large data set that it has a lot of interesting quirks. For example, all the words are mixed in each book, so you cannot use it for a lot of different types of text minings, exactly because you have this instead of the proper text, you have like bags of words for each particular page, but you can use it for some things, such as like LDA topic modeling, for example. We took a subset of fiction only, which is much smaller than the original data with like, hundreds of thousands of books, because we were, first of all, interested in only taking fiction, with reliable publication dates, without duplicates, and so on. And then we end up having a much smaller data set of only around 20,000 books of 2,500 writers. We did topic modeling. I feel like every time, I don't know if that's your feeling as well, but somehow, the last couple of years, every time you use topic LDA, you have to apologize, oh, I used LDA, but I used it instead of topic topic or something like this. So here's my apology that we used LDA, but we used it for a very, I think, good reason. So there are many bad reasons there are reasons to avoid it. For example, it's like very slow, but also it has some advantages, such as that it represents each text as a distribution of topics instead of attributing one topic to a particular text, which is what we wanted for this study. 200 topics, 5,000 word chunks. So the text were split into these word chunks. And this is just to show that we ended up having coherent topics. Okay, blah, 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 not so interesting. All of you know this probably, but yeah, each book is represented by a distribution of topics, so that, we have Agatha Christie. She would have most of the 200 topics, at the very minuscule level, and then she would have several topics really strongly, profoundly expressed, so to say, to use this metaphor from genetics. So they like something about crime and Victorian lifestyle and whatnot. And in case of Isaac Asimov, by the way, it's super funny because he has one super strong topics, and it's like robot, space, and whatnot. So topics can be used as traits to trace them over time. So, for example, we have this topic about park, estate, hall, butler, county servants, library, like a very old school topic, and it is declining over time. And then we have, for whatever reason, the topic of wine, bottle, brandy, drank, glasses. It is increasing over time. I don't know why, but that's really fun. But also, so we have those temporal trajectories, and we use topics as traits. So that's what I want to underline. And then, oh, I have a question. Am I too late? Oh, I feel like I have to apologize since whenever I use topic modeling, no matter the algorithm. I don't know. I wouldn't be so critical. I think it has some uses. So hopefully my talk will also convince you in the opposite. So here is the main thing, basically what we were using, the main format of the data. We had something that we called period author matrix, where we have each row in this matrix. So we had those matrices for each particular topic, and each row here is an individual author. So each row is a career of an author. And on the horizontal axis, you have periods. So history is sliced into 10-year chunks. And the color of the cell is corresponding to the extent to which that particular topic was prevalent in the works of that author in that period of time. So there are some people who start strongly with this topic, number 110, about ladies in society and gentlemen, and then see this, move out of using these topics, like things like this. So this is the format of the data. And what did we find? Applying our decomposition analysis to the real data. So what is the eventual finding? So this is, just to remind you, this is how look the simulated effects for the pure, cohort turnover and pure like individual change or social learning or whatever you call this. And this is the real distribution of topics. So it ends up in this area, which means that basically the relative importance of individual change is 40%. The relative importance of the entrance effect is also 40%, and the relative importance of the exit effect is 20%. If we add up together the entrance and exits, which would be the constituent parts of the cohorts, so to say, two sides of the same coin, because also they are very strongly correlated, we would end up with the same 60% that Underwood and Vasey ended up using a very different method. So this is good because we basically managed to replicate their study using a very different method of analysis. But also what you can see using, for example, this diagram, that you can immediately identify some topics which are, mostly driven by the cohort effects or the effects of the entrance of the, when young authors bring the fresh new blood and bring some new unusual topics with them and start writing about something radically different. And also you can easily identify the clusters of topics that are mostly driven by the individual change, so that those topics that most likely correspond to some historical events or some other things that were really temporary. Another thing that you can achieve using our method is that you can actually look at the distribution of those effects over time. And here I will bring you an example. So this is what I meant by getting higher resolution of the findings. So, for example, here you have a topic that is related to politics, so like government, nation, revolution, leader, freedom, and so on. So this is the curve that you had basically it was kind of growing throughout the observed period. But why was it growing? Why was this topic present more and more in the books? And if you look at those effects, the decomposed effects that we obtained with our decomposition equation, we see that the strongest effect is the effect of individual change, meaning that usually authors, they do not start from writing this, but they change to writing this at a later age. And we have, interestingly, those kind of spikes, which, I don't know, may correspond to some historical events. You know, you have some Versailles Treaty or whatever, and then people start writing more about politics because there is this very significant political event. The opposite situation would be with something like genre literature. So here's the topic which closely corresponds to Westerns, like ranch, trail, sheriff, cattle, saddle, herd, rope, and so on. And the trend line of this topic is very different. It had like its peak moment, and then it had also a period of decline. And why was it growing and why was it declining? And if we look again at the decomposed effects, those demographic effects, you can see that the growth of this curve was mainly due to the arrival of new authors. So a lot of people arrived who started to write Westerns, so young writers. And then at the end, this topic starts declining because a lot of writers, write their last book about Westerns. So literally, Western stopped being a popular genre because the people who were writing it just died. It's not because it lost popularity. It literally was based on the writings of this cohort of people. This is my last slide. So thank you very much for the attention. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions. Hopefully, I didn't miss anything in the chat.
Thank you, Oleg. Yeah, thanks a lot. And also perfect timing, by the way. We were supposed to end right now. And yeah, like you made it exactly. So are there questions? Feel free to speak out aloud or write them in the chat as you wish. You can also raise hands if that's more comfortable for you. I will maybe start. Well, people are still thinking. I have a couple of questions, so I'll start with one. Then, in the meantime, somebody will come up with something smarter. Did I get it right that generally you have to know which effects you're trying to separate them, right? So you kind of have to know that there is this kind of individual change, and then there is this entrance thingy. So, and you basically model each one of them. And if there is some third thing you didn't think of, then it will not really be detectable, right? So it's not a method which kind of allows you to find out.
Yeah, exactly. So this is because so I have a slide on this that I did not include, but there's like a lot of ways to abuse this approach by including just like rubbish variables. Like imagine, because essentially it's looking for correlations. So correlations or covariance in time with change of topics and certain other things. And if you include, I don't know, something nonsensical, you'll probably still find something. And by the way, this is a problem. So sometimes why this approach is much debated in ecology, because at some point people decided, okay, you know what? Let's start putting some really complicated metrics into this equation, like some beta diversity, like different types of ecological, like very complex things calculated using like 3 layers of equations. And you end up having something that you don't know how to interpret. And yes, you find something, but it's quite obscure. In our case, I think we don't have this problem because it seems to be uncontroversial that, such things, those very basic demographic factors probably play a role. And that's why we decided to look at those factors. But in principle, you can include some other stuff as well. Your creativity is the limit, if of course you can justify using it, because I think this is a very important part. But also this is, by the way, partly a reason why the price equation became very popular in biology and ecology, because it looked like magic, like you insert some variables and then you end up having some results and you're happy. So it's a simple tool to use, but also it's a simple tool to abuse. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like things we like in digital humanities, all the methods.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from Fotis in the chat. How do you handle factors like the declining interest in a genre by the public, by publishing houses, etc.?
We don't, unfortunately. It's so far it's only very basic stuff like but this, by the way, that could easily be one of those variables that we actually plug into the equation if we have this data, because if we have this data, we can actually see what is the what is the relative importance of the publishing houses, negative or positive, throughout the timeline, and that would be also quite interesting to
Yeah,
see.
I'm just wondering what sort of the data is here? Like, do you need to know when the publishing houses went out of business or what?
Well, I imagine that. Well, I don't have, maybe Fotis knows, has a clearer example, but I imagine that you can look at the correlation between the disappearance of genres and disappearance of publishing houses, and like on not disappearance, but well, for example, and then or I don't know, different types of editors or something like this. But yeah, that's why we're not using it, because it's not really, we don't have this data. It seems like a rare thing to have, and yeah.
So another question in the chat from Daniel Johnson. Yeah. Any thoughts on the role of stylistics in literary change? For example, one can imagine the popularity of both neoclassical and romantic poems in a nature topic, but they will feel quite different, or the same thing for English novels before and after free indirect discourse.
Yeah, no, this is a great question, because in fact, ideally, we would not look at topics. Like I'm not a big fan of topics, same as many other people, same as you, Danya, but I think that this is sort of like, it would be much better to work with something like artistic forms, and to look at them. And we are thinking about using this approach to poetic forms, where it's much easier to identify what exactly is a form, and the form is a much more meaningful unit, because exactly topics are quite easy to misinterpret, in the way that you can have, as you said, the same topic which can belong to different genres and so on, and it's a bit of a mess, as it's always is with topic modeling. So it's hopefully we'll eventually have better variables or better traits to track over time than topics. But here we kind of like started from repeating the analysis that already exists to make sense that we have similar results. And then we're planning a follow-up study, which will use a lot of data sets with a lot of different traits, and some of them will be stylistic. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, Daniel says topic tell part of the story, but not all. Thanks. It will be interesting to see where the study in form goes. Yeah, I just subscribe to that. And I think Fotis also suggested like a sort of a variable for or data for to measure the effect of the interest in public and publishing houses, like the number of series in a genre.
Ah, okay. I see. Mm.
Yeah, so do we have other questions or like follow-up comments, discussions, disagreements? Well, maybe it's a good time to speak out. Okay, so Itai, brilliant and inspiring presentation. Thanks a lot. Have you tried testing some of your insights by close reading of a sample of the works? Good question. I'm asking because of topic modeling's typical problems.
Yeah, that's the unfortunately we didn't. So for now we were kind of because, as you see, it has a lot of moving parts, uh, yeah. So I agree that this is important to check whether all of this makes sense. So um, why why I'm not sure if I guess part of the reason why we really didn't do the close reading, because yeah, first of all, it's always very frustrating with topic modeling, and it's better not to look at. It's better to just believe that everything works. And second, it's because I think that in the end, what matters more probably, and where I feel there is more reliability, is in the general overarching pattern that we're finding, like those, relative importance of cohort effects versus the individual change effect, and so on. What I'm having much less confidence. I expect there to be a lot of noise exactly in individual topics. So, and I think that eventually this kind of close reading for now of individual topics, for example, and books in those topics, it's not very meaningful. And I think we should just wait until we apply better metrics than topic modeling for our analysis. Yeah. Ideally, frankly, it would be like a combination of different things, like topics, but also different traits extracted using maybe supervised learning or zero-shot learning from the texts, and combining this into some sort of combinations that correspond to of those things that correspond to different genres, because that's how it is in reality.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yeah. Fotis. So do you already have an idea how to mix general nomothetic rules and ideographic aspects into one model to describe and explain one large historical event like modernism?
Ooh, that's a big one. I don't know how to answer. That's a very good question. I hope that our historical, networks of literature, which we are now struggling with, and we're like experimenting with a lot of different methods and trying that would make sense. That those would allow us, on the one hand, to capture the some general principles, such as like the recombination in those networks and how new interesting genres appear with those big ideographic events. Exactly that, because then we could actually capture some signal of those big events. That would be quite interesting to look at. Yeah, but we're not there yet, unfortunately. But that's the goal.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thank you, Fotis, for the profound question, as always. Any other questions, thoughts, suggestions? How to proceed further? Yeah, I mean, in the meantime, I'm also wondering, so basically this zeitgeist that you mentioned, it's a bit like what I mentioned before as the state of the world, right? And it's also a bit kind of like, if you have more of this kind of individual change, then basically you measure some event which sent a lot of kind of rubbles in the pond and basically created some hype, or like negative kind of hype, like when we're talking about wars and, I don't know, epidemics. So basically, your method is kind of good in distinguishing this stuff, or like more like kind of waves which are just into the like explosions in the society in a way, versus I don't know, something which is more of literary genesis, right? Versus some things which are actually literary kind of communities emerging and just kind of promoting some specific genre or specific kind of, I don't know, maybe it's not genre, but I don't know, aesthetic. So could you also reason about this way? So more like things which are more of a social genesis, and things which are more of internal kind of literary genesis.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So that's how I was also thinking about this, that those cohorts would allow us to, like in the example with Westerns, it would allow us to track something like genres or artistic forms, while the zeitgeist exactly would correspond to some kind of like content, which is so form versus content a little bit in this case, which is usually generated by some or often is generated by some external events or forces. Again, we stumble at the same thing, that topics are not very good for distinguishing between forms and those external events. So it would be better to use something else. But this is the hunch precisely, that literary communities are being formed in some way through those generational processes, and then you have the spikes that happen as the kind of like external pushes from the I don't know from of politics of I don't know natural disasters, like stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's cool. I mean, basically you can distinguish the kind of the spikes which emerge from just a group of writers choosing to write this way from something that has an external code. So it's like, I mean, it sounds good, especially if we think of like typical criticism towards, for instance, what was popular a decade ago as culturomics. I mean, that the typical criticism was that you basically can't distinguish between things which are of different codes. So I mean,
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's the goal, to separate between these different forces. And we have also this is something that I was not talking about, but this is because it takes a little bit more time to implement, but we will also add the like the age structure to our model, so that we will look at into the generations of people, like people who are in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s, in their 60s, and then we would see over time which generations or which age cohorts were most influential in different periods of time. For example, I have my hunch that in the past, young writers were more influential than they are now. I think now it's mostly older people. That's at least if you look at the literary prizes and things like this, usually, we have increased age at which those prizes are given, interestingly, both in popular fiction and in like high literature. But again, is it the case? Is it not? This is the like another follow-up to this. So, and in principle, you can, yeah, as I said, like you can plug in some other variables in this approach, into this equation, and to see like to look at some other effects that you're interested in.
thank you. So yeah, let's have one last call for the questions, maybe, if there are any. Feel free to ask them. You can also do it by voice, by switching on your mic, or writing to the chat. I guess this means a no, this sound that we heard. So then thanks again, Oleg, for coming here and sharing this stuff. And I think that's a lot of it is quite inspiring and can be, the ideas can be reapplied in other domains and wherever you have this dynamic kind of processes happening and generated by groups of people, basically, which is almost everywhere. So I think, yeah, thanks a lot for sharing this stuff. And
thank you. Yeah,
I guess
very
whoever
much.
is interested can contact Oleg directly on
Yeah, definitely.
different social networks like Twitter or whatever, and email. And yeah, and keep stay tuned for the next Code and Culture sessions. And I hope those of you who came enjoyed it at least slightly, and thanks for all the questions. And by the way, we managed to do almost 2 hours of DH talk without ever mentioning ChatGPT. Yay!
I was very close, but then,
We were close once, but yeah. So yeah, thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank
And
you very much as well. Yeah.
see you next time.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.